Thanks, Richard, for the introduction. So I will have to disappoint you a little bit today. We're talking about not the nano, but the ultra macro scale, as you can see on this rendition of just floating mirrors on an open ocean. So in my group, we usually work on interface at the atomic and the nano scales, and we are interested in developing instrumentation, like new methods to synthesize materials and to investigate phenomena such as developing a variant of AFM that we call magnetic resonance force microscopy that would eventually have the capability to study material in three-dimensional at the atomic scale and also giving atomic information on their chemical identities, basically what chemists like Professor Winkler was alluding to as being useful. So in this example, for example, we developed a method to grow like nanowires, single crystal nanowires with arbitrary crystal orientation. And I think last year I talked about how we were able to use nanoscale devices to elucidate the kinetics of charge transfer at a heterogeneous nanoscale interface. And all this effort is driven by, basically, in the end, a scientific challenge. And in order to to discover new science, we're constantly obliged to develop new tools. And to develop new tools, it's basically engineering challenges. So we see a self-reinforcing feedback loop that we spend a lot of our time trying to advance the whole endeavor. But today, I don't get to talk about these exciting projects because my students will have the opportunity in the afternoon to share our latest discoveries on these fronts. But I'm taking this opportunity to talk about the climate crisis, because nowadays it's hard to pass a single day without being bombarded by news of floods and accelerating melting of ice and extreme weathers. And at Harvard, for example, we routinely get news every morning from the Gazette telling us what to eat, how we should behave as private individuals in order to try to combat this crisis. And I think this morning we had some floods in Venice that are potentially linked to the climate crisis. And it's a little bit embarrassing, I think, for adults and the scientists that it seems like nowadays it's the children who are taking the lead in trying to solve this crisis. So I think it's time for us as a community of scientists to do our due diligence and to really look into the issue deeply and comprehensively to see, are we missing something? So now I prepared a little exercise for everybody in the room and perhaps for the audience who's watching this video. So basically, I did a Google search, climate change graphs, in order to see what's it about. Nowadays, we usually turn to Google and let's see what Google gives us back. So I'm going to just show some graphs, and I want each of you to take notes and just mental notes to see what you notice. And at the end, let's have a short discussion on what you notice that's striking about these data. So here we have, some solar irradiance as a function of time, and that's like CO2 concentrations, etc. So I will stop talking for now and just let you gaze at the graph, and I will click through every few seconds or so. So basically, these are graphs that I take in the order in which Google suggests to me. All right, so anybody have any comments on what we have just seen in these graphs?
Can you go back on the time scale?
The
What's the start of the
maybe that's a century ago, I think, or yeah.
When did they do actual recording? When did they start keeping records?
Okay, when did they start to do actual records?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good comment. Actually, we'll come back to this point later. So obviously, there was nobody there before, earlier than a few hundred years ago to take data. So a lot of the measurements are derived from sources such as Antarctica ice cores. So there's, for example, tiny bubbles of air that's trapped in there, and you can analyze those to get a snapshot of the historical record. Sorry?
They all end up
high. Yeah, so that's a good observation. A lot of these graphs have an upward trend, so that's one thing. Any other striking?
seems to oscillate and have periodicity.
Yes, that's another thing. So there's some natural variability, obviously, in the climate system, and that's been exploited by some communities or interpreted by certain communities as the current oscillation being part of the natural cycle, right? So that's a very good point. Any other additions? Exponential increase. Yeah, maybe. We don't have enough time, but maybe we won't be able to have this discussion if it was really, going to continue on that trend. But OK, so those are very good observations. But it's not the trend that jumped out to me personally when I saw these graphs. So let's just click through and look at what's on the x-axis. Time, 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 time. Time is a very human construct, right? It's like something we humans understand in order to think about the past and to predict the future. So this view of climate change is very anthropocentric. So basically, we have been looking at climate change from only the point of view of humans, as if we are the only thing that matters in this universe. And I think that's a problem, and that's what's keeping us from finding a real solution. So perhaps, keeping this anthropocentric view, we humans, what do we depend on? We depend on our food to survive in the end. And the greatest risk we're facing as a species is the near-term inability to grow enough food to feed a growing population. And there's overwhelming scientific consensus in the agricultural and food production community that I won't have time to go into. But also, if we only focus on this time axis, and we're basically reducing a very complex problem of climate change that's multi-parametric. It's affecting not only the temperature mean, but also the variance. Like precipitation can also change the salinity of oceans and the partial pressure of oxygen in different water levels, and even the nutrient quality of things that grow on land and in the sea. But if we focus our attention, say, in the increase of CO2 or increase of temperature, we're collapsing this very complex system to a single line and basically focusing on CO2. And we are committing ourselves to a lost tug of war with powerful interests at our expense. So it's, I think, a problem to equate climate change to CO2 emissions or reductions. That's a dangerous simplification. So I have a few goals for today. The first one is to lay to rest the debate about whether climate change is man-made, the current climate change is human-induced or not. It's undeniably real. You will see a new way to look at the data that shows that. And that we have to implement a solution on global scale now, within the next couple of years. Otherwise, it's game over for everybody within the next couple of decades. And this is, before I go into this one, these two should be clear to everybody in this room and in the scientific community. But what may not be clear to us, the people who are actually caring about this issue, is that 100% renewable starting today is not enough. It's actually a very dangerous distraction, as you will see why. And secondly, to reverse this planetary scale catastrophe, we really need to focus our limited resource and limited time in one set of comprehensive solution. And the solution has to be rooted in what we have on this planet. We don't have enough perovskite, for example, to save the world, just to give it one example. So we should, instead of looking at climate change from our selfish point of view, we should look at climate change from there, basically the ecosystem, the food that supports us, from their point of view. And let's just take a very slight twist. Instead of plotting time, let's just co-plot atmospheric CO2 and temperature on these two axes, and just observe, like in history, what regions of the space has been capable of supporting life. And the data are taken from these papers and the sources. So right off the bat, I would just show a few representative data points to show on what time scale we have sufficiently high time resolution data for these two parameters to enable a co-plotting of them. So the oldest data points dates back slightly shy of 1 million years old. I think recently there is some scattered data point dating back to 2 million years old, but it's not at a sufficiently high time resolution for addition to this analysis. And at that time, basically, the human family split into several groups, and we are one of them, and we're capable of doing arts. And 10,000 years ago, everybody in this room on the planet had the same ancestor. And here is a scatter plot of all the data we have at a sufficiently high temporal resolution. And I'm color coding the data points on a logarithmic scale, how many years before present, and only plotting until right before we started to burn coal in 1750, roughly. So we see that before humans started to burn coal, there's some natural variability, say over 1,000 years old on both the CO2 and temperature axis. It's quite small, but let's give it 10 times more time to 10,000 years range. Then we see that both parameters scan through the whole range, that the whole Earth system just cyclically samples through over the past million years. Somebody mentioned this periodicity, so that's exactly what we see here. But after we start to burn coal, lo and behold, we have a very drastic departure on this two-dimensional plane. And the time scale are also striking compared to the natural level of variability. I think on this analysis alone, it's obvious that what's happening is not part of natural variability. Another way to look at this is to look at the annual displacement vector on this two-dimensional plane of CO2 and temperature. And we see that before we started to burn coal, say 1,000 years ago, or before, we have annual, sometimes it gets warmer one year, colder one year, and there's some excursion in CO2 levels, but never consistently going up both in temperature and CO2, as we have witnessed in the past decade or so. And that's a replot of the data on a wider scale in CO2. And these are linear fits to the data with 95% confidence intervals. And we see that the current trajectory is on a different line. So what's causing that? So Earth is a very massive system, right? And it's got a thermal mass, and also vegetations take time to change. Continents can move, and ice cap can melt. So when you have one perturbation, a driving factor, which in this case is CO2 concentrations, the rest of the system needs time to catch up. And some can catch up faster than others. So those can follow quickly, will give you an overall slope that we call the transient climate response. And if everything were allowed to equilibrate over millennia, then we would expect to go to that line. But of course, the timescale are different. And for the most immediate problem, that's not really relevant. So in the climate community, these slopes are called transient climate response and Earth system sensitivity. But of course, one minor difference being usually people plot climate forcing, like how many watts per meter excess energy or energy deficit we have. But the two are, climate forcing and CO2 are very highly correlated because that's by far the major climate forcer. So we already went through that. So our food may wonder, so why are you telling me about this complicated analysis? So why should, say, a plant or an animal care about this analysis? The reason is that we can actually consider this 2D graph as a phase space of life. So there are regions on this 2D graph that can support life as we know it in our current environment. And we can even plot boundary lines outside of which we cannot live. So plants will actually starve when the CO2 concentrations falls below about 30 to maybe 50 ppm depending on the temperature. So they need CO2 to do photosynthesis, obviously. So removing all CO2 is actually bad. And when there's too much CO2, our blood will be acidified, and ocean will be acidified, and acid will just kill life. So that's also obviously not good. And at different levels of overall heating, people have experimentally and empirically observed, like at even 1 degree Celsius, we have a local extinctions called extirpations of different populations. So that's already very dangerous at 1 degree C. And at 2 degrees C increase, experimentally has been shown that you can actually induce, collapse of whole communities. And even higher, that's basically spelling biological annihilation. That's a term that's published in the literature from the biological sciences. And today, we'll briefly just go into these two limits because that's the trajectory we're on course to traverse. So here's a summary of studies of CO2 concentration and the duration at that concentration and the effect on humans. And we start to see negative effects at around 1,000, 2,000 parts per million. And for experimental work on different sea creatures, also agree that at concentrations above 1,000 or so ppm, we have uniformly negative effects on different categories of phyla of sea creatures. So what's causing, so we have a constraint on the CO2. Let's also look at how increasing temperature will affect the performance of life. So here is a plot of what's called a performance curve of life as a function of temperature. And there are several things to focus on. First, I want to draw your attention to this just black curve. So that's basically your basal metabolic rate. As the temperature increases, you need to process more oxygen and more energy to do cellular functions. So your aerobic needs increases, your basal needs increases. But of course, in order to move around and to do things, we also need extra energy. And our ability to do that is the red curve here. And the difference between what you can generate in terms of power and what you need, the minimum power to survive, is your ability to function as a species. And the difference is shown as the green curve here. So we see that there's an optimal temperature at which you're most fit and be able to produce the most. And in many systems, it turns out that the curve has a gentle increase and a very sudden drop-off at the high temperature end. And that's quite general for different animals. And for plants, we basically have the same trend for different processes that they have to undergo. And it's even the same for viruses and bacteria, but the mechanism is slightly different. But the general trend is that we have this inverted bell shape for life on Earth. And some people looked at the effect of changing temperature distribution on the performance of life, given this very general inverted bell shape of life. So let's consider this red distribution in temperature. So this temperature mapped onto this thermal performance curve will give you average performance axis on the performance axis of, say, 0.8. But let's say climate change has induced a larger variance of the temperature. That smearing out of the temperature distribution when mapped onto this curve will give you this kind of performance shape, the average of which will be lower. So the organisms will be less fit. And if we have a symmetry on top of that, smearing out of the temperature, we again have a lowering of the performance. And here is the data of average temperature in the northern hemisphere back in 1950 and versus 2011. And we see that three things are happening. One is you have a shifting of the mean of about like 1.5 degrees, and you have a smearing out of the width of the distribution, which is this case. And also you have a top-end heavy skewed distribution. And the combination of all these three with this very simple theoretical analysis shows that it's just normal to see like ecosystems performing less well given the current experiment we're running. All right. And these analyses have been confirmed by more recent publications. And basically, what we are observing is a shifting of the mean and a symmetry bias toward the hotter end. And experimental, I think I'm going to go severely over time. OK. Oh, yeah, OK. All right. So people have done an experiment to demonstrate that for at least certain species of plants, a gentle 2 to 3 degree increase in average temperature is enough to kill the whole population. So the researchers installed these radiative panels to locally heat certain areas of the mountain, and they monitored the temperature in the area that's heated versus the control area next to it that's not heated. And the one variable they measured was when did the snow start to melt in the heated versus not heated areas. And then so this data basically shows that heating was successful. And then they followed the life cycle of a particular plant from the time when it's a seed through its germination and then its multi-year growth. So strikingly, the researchers found that in the heated areas, the number of seeds produced by the plant basically plunges to close to zero. So they become much less fertile compared to in the colder neighbors. And over several years, like year 1, 2, 3, the number of plants surviving also goes down. So basically, life expectancy of the plants goes down by more than 50%. And with the net result that you drive the species to local extinction after a few years. And another example that's empirical observation of sea star population. There was a heat wave a few years ago on the West Coast, and with like less than 2 degrees Celsius rise in water temperature, the population of sea stars across the entire coast basically plunges to zero. So 2 degrees Celsius is enough to basically exterminate certain species. So now we have reviewed just some very small fraction of the data that's supporting drawing this upper limit for CO2 and these limits for the temperature that on Earth that we shouldn't be crossing. And the data we have now is indicating that we're on course to breaking all those boundaries within the next 20 to 30 years. And obviously, in order to reverse the trend, we need to gain mobility in the negative temperature axis, either going this way, that way, doesn't matter. Whatever path you follow, we have to be able to gain mobility on the temperature axis, and less urgently on the CO2 axis, because we have a more buffer in that dimension. So now we're ready to discuss why 100% renewable energy today is not enough. So here are plotted annual displacement vectors by using 100% of a particular renewable energy, for example, say we're using 100% photovoltaic to power the world, we will move every year by this much in CO2 emissions and say 0.01 degree Celsius on the temperature axis. And wind energy, for example, will give us a much larger rise in temperature if we were to use it, because the process of wind energy generation involves friction between the wind and the turbine blades, and that can generate heat. So that's one effect that's not talked about. So if we, say, went to 100% wind today, we would be breaking the 2 Celsius record globally immediately. So that's a very bad idea. So wind energy, as great engineering marvel as it is, should not be implemented on a global scale. And some people propose to grow trees and use forests to power the world. Oh, well, just the albedo heating from dark forest will cook us all to death. But we need not to worry, because there's not enough land on Earth to support enough forest to support our economy. So that's just not irrelevant at this moment. But regardless, if we were going to go to renewable energies, the best renewable energy we have is solar thermal, concentrating solar thermal energy. That's the only one that makes sense given this analysis, both in cost and on environmental impact. So governments and investors should put their money into solar thermal energy. That's the only rational and ethical choice at this moment. But the common trend for all of these vectors is that they're pointing in positive temperature and positive CO2 direction. So there's no way using these methods alone to go to this quadrant where we urgently need to go to save this planet. So renewable energies are important, but they're not sufficient. And actually, going to renewables today and abandoning coal without doing complementary measures to combat the heating is dangerous. Why? Because of what's shown here below 0. So that's a plot of effective overheating or cooling of the Earth by different components in the atmosphere. It's appeared in many publications, including this publication that's taking data from, I think, IPCC reports. But anyways, so the CO2 that we emit are heating the Earth at currently about 2 watts per meter squared, roughly. And other greenhouse gases are also contributing their share. Luckily for us, at the same time as these bad guys are heating, we also have other bad guys like the smog and aerosols that's actually keeping us cool. So let's imagine that we stopped burning coal today. What's going to happen? So the aerosols, the smog, the PM 2.5, what have you, will fall out of the sky within 2 days. The CO2, however, has a lifetime of centuries, if not millennia. So rather than having a sum, which is the black curve that's here, if we lost all of that aerosol protection as of today, the heating would jump up to there with catastrophic impacts. So until we have a measure to compensate for this, we are trapped in burning coal. Actually, the dirtier, the better. It's something that's that scientists and engineers have not been honest in discussing. And that's not, we need to be open and honest if we are really going to solve this. And here is an estimate of how much the aerosols are actually cooling us, the latest results. It's about 1.6 plus minus 0.2 watts per square meter. And what does that mean in terms of temperature? Well, this very recent latest estimate shows that every watt per square meter corresponds to about 0.84 degrees of heating. You multiply those two numbers together, you get more than 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature if we stop burning coal. So don't stop burning coal as of yet. And the evidence is abundantly clear. All right, so now we have seen that 100% renewable is not enough. We obviously need to take some complementary measures to reverse the planetary scale catastrophe. And because we're operating under a time constraint of 10 years at current economic outputs and very limited resources, we really need to focus on one set of a framework that can address everything comprehensively using what's available, what's abundant. So what is abundant on this planet? We have a lot of sunlight, actually too much of it. We have a lot of rocks and sand that people consider to be waste, useless. We have a lot of seawater. We have a lot of people. That's a resource. We need people to do things, to build things. We have a lot of air, and we have a lot of pollution. So our solution will only use these elements as starting material. And today, because of the constraint of time, we'll just discuss examples using the top panel of starting materials. All right, so sunlight plus desert sand, what we have. We can make glass. So it's been demonstrated a couple years ago in Switzerland that you can just concentrate the sunlight and use that to heat mixtures of sand to have glass. And glass is a wonderful structural material that we can build things with. So what can we make from glass? Well, we can make mirrors of different shapes. Mirrors are basically glass with a thin layer of metal coating. And we, as nanoscale scientists, we understand the power of nanostructuring and going down from a three-dimensional bulk to a thin film. We save on material. So with glass, which is abundant as a structural support, and a thin film of aluminum, say 50 to 100 nanometers, we can make enough mirrors to reject enough sunlight to cool the planet. Well, the scale is actually quite massive. It's 3 to 4% of Earth's surface area if we want to return to pre-industrial temperatures in 1750, but maybe we don't need that much. We only need to stabilize it, so it's, I think, entirely feasible. We can also use mirrors to concentrate the sunlight to generate electricity, as in concentrating solar thermal. And very luckily for us, we only need 0.2% of Earth's surface coverage by mirrors to power the whole world. And that's a very small fraction of the mirror that's needed to cool the planet. So if we decided to save ourselves by cooling the planet by installing a planetary air conditioning system, we get renewable energy for free. So that's just a side benefit of environmental remediation. And there's also the problem of ocean acidification. And people are talking about, we need to remove CO2 from the air. But I propose to you there's a much better method to do that. We can use limestone, which is one of the most abundant rocks on Earth. We hit it with sunlight to drive off CO2 on site in 100% concentrated form. We can bury that into the ground, geologic formations. And we take that calcium oxide that's resulting from this conversion process. We ship it to the sea, sprinkle into the sea, and it will react with CO2 that's absorbed by the ocean, large surface area, very fast kinetics, free exchange. And the reaction will produce dissolved calcium carbonate. And that will help the shellfish grow and also neutralize acidity. So that's the most efficient way to do carbon dioxide drawdown. So let's just visualize how much area that's needed to cool the planet. It's basically covering ocean that's the size of the United States. That's massive. But of course, if we chose 100% implementation on land, we can use all the desert. It's still massive. So in practice, if we were only going to use this cooling mirroring effect, we need 15 to 20 trillion square meters, or we can use half of that and maybe parts of the desert. But that's still a massive scale, so I think we should combine this strategy with the carbon dioxide drawdown method. So here is a analysis of what would result if we divided, say, 3% of GDP per year for the next 10 years to do this carbon dioxide drawdown or temperature reduction by rejecting sunlight. So if we used 100% of our budget to build MEERs for 10 years only. We produce enough MEERs to bring us down to a temperature which is the same as pre-industrials. Of course, we're still moving in a positive CO2 direction. Why? Because we're assuming we're still a fossil fuel economy to power this endeavor, which is OK. Once we're there, temperature is the main driver. CO2 really doesn't matter. Actually, it helps with agriculture. So that's a very comfortable spot to be in if we want to do 100% MEER solar radiation engineering, solar radiation management. On the other extreme, if we use the 100% of the MEERs or the budget to build MEERs and the furnaces, solar furnaces, to break down limestone and to sprinkle quicklime into the ocean, we will have less of a temperature effect, but we will have reduced CO2 concentrations a lot, back to 380 ppm. In comparison to this ocean liming strategy, the most talked about direct air capture, that's all in the news and the companies are investing in, for the same budget, they will not be able to even balance out the emissions. So those companies I iterate, I mean, people shouldn't put their money in those companies. It's a lunacy. Even doubling the funding will not allow them to do anything substantial. And the 3% GDP assumes no economy of scaling. So if we take that into account, the figure could be like 0.03%. So it's obviously feasible. All right, so I really want to iterate the point of why ocean liming is the only rational CO2 capture method. So this sort of filter in the air is basically capturing something from thin air, 418 ppm. It costs theoretically a minimum of 21 kilojoule per mole and corresponding to $200 per ton to capture CO2 this way. When we capture directly from a solar furnace that's producing CO2 from the decomposition of calcium carbonate, we have 20 times or more efficient process energetically and economically. And this quicklime, somebody actually, talented master student, I think in Norway, just studied the kinetics of quicklime dissolution in seawater, and it dissolves very, very well, like on order of tens of minutes. So if you sprinkle before it reaches bottom, it will have completely dissolved. So that's very encouraging. But both methods of CO2 capture have one common bottleneck that needs more research. That's what are we going to do with the CO2 that we either capture or we produce on site? Apparently, there doesn't seem to be enough geological storage currently in the whole world to store all that stuff. But the field has not been fully funded to do the research necessary to see whether there are more reserves or whether we can create them by artificial means. So that's one area that needs more work. But what we can conclude for sure is that that's a big no-no. So again, for the media friends out there, let's just put that to rest. All right, so where are we going to get the calcium carbonate from? Well, we can, of course, break open mountains and get them from quarries, but we can actually use what we consider as waste. After eating the seafood, you have these shells. The shells we can just heat to a few hundred degrees to 1,000 degrees and produce calcium oxide in really highly pure form of basically 97% or more. So, and that's confirmed by recent studies. And so I did a fun experiment this past weekend. So we say that abs are made in the kitchen. I think saving the world also starts in the kitchen. So I bought myself 2 bags of oysters from Whole Foods. And together they're like 3 kilos, like 6-7 pounds. And I cleaned them out and disposed of the organics by human consumption in one sitting. That's all the shells that's produced. put one of them into the furnace and heat it for 3 hours. Of course, you can do that by solar thermal means, but we don't have a solar furnace as of yet. And the resulting shell cracked into powder that I'm putting into this wafer box. You sprinkle a little bit into some sparkling water, San Pellegrino, or some DI water, and you take the pH, and they are either neutral or basic. So obviously, it's working. So that's just a fun weekend experiment. So, and if you do a calculation, let's say everybody on Earth, let's mobilize everybody to eat oysters, and oysters only for every meal, 365 days a year. We would collectively produce enough shells to make enough calcium oxide to basically balance out our global CO2 emissions. So oysters should save the world. I think there's more slide, but it's not clicking. Okay, here.
You force people to eat only one kind of food. You have to achieve communism first.
Yes, very good point. Or we can be smart about it, as I'm about to show. So vertical farming of shellfish is it's already existing technology. And we obviously have enough area to farm them, even if assuming we're only doing 2D. If going to 3D will be more efficient, and the area that's required to farm all that oyster is only a fraction of what's needed to do the temperature management by these floating MEER arrays that I showed on my cover slide. And of course, obviously, we can produce much more than we actually need to consume as humans, so we can feed these guys to other things that are perhaps more tasty than oysters. Right? So there is hope for the culinarily inclined. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Edwin H. Land, who had the vision to start the Roland Institute, giving early career PIs like myself the freedom to do crazy things and to depart from our the project that we're hired for, and to just do what we think is important. All right. Thank you. So questions? Yes.
If we need to put mirrors, how distributed should they be?
How many what?
How distributed?
How distributed? Okay, that's a very good question. So obviously, if we put everything at one location, let's say, that location will be extremely cold, right? And that will certainly reroute global circulations, and the weather patterns will be disrupted. And the climate scientists have worked very hard on these issues in the past couple of decades, and the latest models are able to predict effect on precipitation and weather events as a function of local albedo modifications. So the implementation locations and exactly where to put them on land and at sea will follow recommendations by climate science simulations.
Wouldn't you put it in the poles?
On the poles?
We already have a lot of snow there.
Yes. So the thing is incremental impact. The slows are already quite reflective. So for every MEER you put there, you get maybe 20% gain over snow. But if you put that on the ocean absorbs 92% or more of the sunlight. So for MEER with a reflectivity of 0.95, you get 80% plus reflection of the incident area. So you need less MEERs, of course. But of course, it's nice to keep the poles frozen to keep the jet stream intact. And I think there are people whose research is focused on addressing that problem. But I think that's a rather local problem. And this is a more zoomed out view of what needs to happen. And putting them close to the equator is probably more bang for your buck, if you will.
To avoid even more CO2 contribution by baking all those oysters at thousands of degrees to pulverize them, you mentioned solar thermal.
Yes.
But have you factored in the manufacture and the prime materials that we would need to
Yes.
make all those solar?
Very, very good question, yes. So there's always the concern that making stuff will emit CO2, and we're afraid to use stuff because of the CO2 tag attached to them. So I didn't have time to really go into the literature, but once we decouple temperature and the CO2 from each other. CO2 is not a concern. And it's this fixation on the equivalence of temperature and CO2 that's trapping us from reaching a solution. So we can basically implement the whole project using fossil fuel energy, and we'll still be fine. And that's probably what we should do, because it's the fastest way we know how to move forward. And it's probably the only way we can get political traction, say by making a deal with the fossil fuel interests. Okay, let's expand your business by tenfold for the next 10 years, but you have to sign this contract. By the end of that, you have to support solar thermal, concentrate in solar thermal energy. Right? So that's one way the everybody can come together to reach consensus. Yes?
Do we have time to wait for climate deniers to die, or do we have to change their perception?
Everybody here in this room will witness the end if we don't do anything. No. Yes.
I've seen like estimates that to line the oceans, you need something like every boat on the planet. Do you have any analysis of the scale?
So to line the ocean, so usually these individual solutions, they assume that's the only solution that's being implemented. If we do this framework, right, when the temperature is partially controlled by the MEERs, the kinetics of ocean liming, the urgency at which we need to implement becomes less urgent. And actually, I want to point out, so at high CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, land plants grow faster, but they become less nutritious. However, in the sea, like algae, they grow faster and they become more nutritious. They have more nitrogen content. So moving farming to the sea is the only logical approach. Yes.
First of all, I'm really jealous that you can bring your kitchen stuff to the lab. It's not allowed in the State University.
Ah, okay.
So we kind of mentioned the solar thermal, but if you look at the distribution of solar irradiation around the world,
Yeah.
so most of them are actually in countries like Saudi Arabia,
Yes.
places like California.
Yes.
And if you look at, for example, China, they already have tons of PM2.5 particles flying in the air.
Yes.
So you might not have enough photon coming in.
That's right.
Right, so would you still think the solar thermal solution for countries like that?
So I see this climate challenge as an opportunity for humans to come together as one species. It's a test. It's a challenge for us. Either we come together with political unity or we all perish. And in that process, recognizing that everybody is the same, we're basically the same family, and we have to do this together, and we need to distribute tasks, say energy production, manufacturing, and distribution equitably is something we need to work out on political level. So there's more than enough land, even just in, say, parts of China to support the whole country. So solar thermal is very, very, very efficient. So it's at peak operating capacity, it's 35% or more efficiency from photon to electron energy conversion. So it's much better than photovoltaics. So that's not really a concern, but I would rather also view this as an opportunity to have a global consensus. We can develop the infrastructure, say, where there's most solar irradiance in the Middle East, in the Sahara Desert. But in exchange, the countries who have their land partially devoted to powering the world should also receive benefits from the rest of us who are consuming that product. So we need, as scientists, first come to a consensus of the validity of this framework, and then also talk to people, like people around you, people you know in other countries, and emphasize the importance of equity, of distribution, and to get political support for this kind of global effort, and erase the boundaries, basically. And long-distance transportation of electricity by high-voltage DC exists. 3% loss over 1,000 kilometers. So there's no problem transporting from Saudi Arabia to China, Saudi Arabia to the UK. Yes?
Ocean acidity is also a big part of climate change.
Yes.
I'm wondering your ocean lining strategy, does it have any effect on acidity change?
Oh, it's basically reversing that. Yeah, so ocean lime calcium oxide, when dissolved in water, well, you can conceptually CaO plus H2O gives you Ca parenthesis OH2. So it's a calcium hydroxide, which is basic. So that thing will react with the carbonic acid that's in the seawater to make it less acidic. So basically, that's you're de-acidifying the ocean and drawing down CO2. Yeah.
So I got a quick question about. So you haven't mentioned the solution from the people and the pollutions. So is any kind of concern about that? Because what you talk about is from the perspective of building the murals and using the solar cells. And how about restricting the humans' activities? Let's say save some waste. Is there any combination of these two, or just because you talk about based on the
Yes.
continued human activity?
It's very good question. So it's something that's on our mind every day, like how to live more sustainably. I think the global stage is set for this kind of transition in mentality and value systems. Many people are becoming vegan because they have a concern for the planet and their next generation. So I think efforts to promote, say, veganism or environmental awareness are very laudable, and we should support those to the best of our efforts. However, only focusing on those are not enough, but we should still support them. We should focus our economics and intellectual power on promoting the first order solutions that will actually make the sufficient quantitative difference. But having the awareness support in the general population by introducing veganism and the link, even though weak, between responsible personal behavior and sustainable future, that's very important. And another example, we really need to restructure, the transportation infrastructure, especially in this country, right? So there's no need to drive a car. It's like the most stupid invention that's invented. I think you're hauling 90% or more of just the dead mass, and what you're transporting is less than 10% of the mass. So one way to say, as an intermediate step to not destroy the highway system here, we can say let's all move to velomobiles, which are, say, 1 or 2 person enclosed bicycles, and let's electrify them. These are, 100 pounds or less in weight, and they go 60 miles per hour with a fraction of the energy cost of cyclists. So velomobiles is by far the most efficient way of transportation, even more so than walking or cycling by order of magnitude. So, and those, you can divide highways, each lane into 2 lanes for the velomobiles because they're narrow, like 1-seater. So we would solve congestion problems in all major US cities if we just made a law. Okay, let's all move to velomobiles. And there won't be safety issues because if everybody's light, crashes won't really kill you. And there's no big cars to kill you. So that's what we should do if we were rational. Scientists, we need engineers, we need to come to a consensus. Then we, need to bring this idea to politicians and people around us and just encourage people to think rationally. Yes?
I think we'll make this the last question. I've got to get back on track here.
Yeah. Yes?
So if you put all these mirrors on the oceans, is there any concern that first the temperature drops in the oceans? Any concerns about things like sea life or something like that?
Yeah, of course. You don't want to overcool, just as you don't want to overheat. But the current problem we have is overheating. And this overheating of the ocean, represented by the thermal content of the oceans, is what's driving extreme weathers and also coral bleaching events. So by cooling them, we will help coral communities to rebuild. All of the ecosystem papers in the order of like hundreds to maybe 1,000 that I looked through in this project are reaching basically consensus that temperature is the common force or stressor that's killing ecosystems. CO2 will have an effect when it's on the order of 1,000, 2,000 ppm, but not at the current level. And when you remove the temperature forcer, generally tolerance to CO2 increases much more. So yes, we want to cool, and that's what we intend to do. But of course, we don't want to cool too much that it's over the board. But given how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere, for the next few centuries, we will not cool enough. The fear is that we will not cool. We will not cool too much. The fear is that we will not be able to cool enough to restore ecosystem to its pre-industrial levels.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the.